Imagine standing in the dark. Not the kind of dark you get in a city, where streetlights hum and car headlights sweep past your window. This is a different kind of dark, the kind that only exists in the deep hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, where the nearest town is an hour away and the nearest help is even further. The trees are bare, the wind is moving through them like a slow exhale, and somewhere up in the ridgeline a wolf begins to howl. Then a second one answers, then a third, and the sound rolls down the mountain like a warning that nobody in the valley below is prepared to hear. On the night of November 14th, 1978, every single person in Harlan Ridge, West Virginia, locked their doors. But they did not lock them because of the wolves. They locked them because of a 17-year-old girl standing barefoot in the middle of the town square, surrounded by 6 full-grown timber wolves. Her feet were bare on the frozen ground, her breath was visible in the cold air, and she was smiling. Not the kind of smile that comes from joy, not the kind that comes from relief. It was the smile of someone who had finally stopped running from the truth. 340 people lived in Harlan Ridge. Every one of them was watching from behind curtains and through cracked doors. Not one of them stepped outside. Not one of them called her name. Because in that moment, they were not afraid of the wolves. They were afraid of her. They were afraid of what she knew. And they were afraid of what would happen if the outside world ever found out what this town had done. Within 48 hours, that girl would vanish. The wolves would disappear from the mountains as if they had never existed. And Harlan Ridge would bury a secret so deep, so carefully hidden beneath decades of false and half-truths, that it would take nearly 30 years before anyone had the courage to dig it up. This is the story of Ellie Macomb, the girl who whispered to wolves. But here's what you need to understand before we go any further. This story is not really about wolves at all. The wolves were never the danger. The danger was something else entirely. And by the time you understand what it was, you will never look at a small town the same way again. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, to understand what happened on that night in November, we need to ask 3 questions. 3 questions that the people of Harlan Ridge spent 15 years trying to make sure nobody ever asked. The first question is this: how does a girl from a town with no veterinarian, no wildlife research center, no scientific background of any kind, develop what multiple witnesses would later describe as a conversation with wild timber wolves? Not trained animals, not zoo specimens. Wild Appalachian timber wolves, apex predators that had roamed those mountains for centuries and had never once allowed a human being to come within 100 yards without fleeing. Ellie Macomb did not just get close to them, she walked among them, she sat with them, and according to at least 4 separate eyewitnesses, they responded to her as if she were one of their own. The second question is more troubling. Why did the entire town of Harlan Ridge, all 340 residents, collectively decide that a teenage girl was more dangerous than a pack of apex predators? What was it about Ellie Macomb that frightened them so deeply that they were willing to lock her away in a state psychiatric facility rather than let her keep walking into those mountains? Were they afraid of the wolves? Or were they afraid of what Ellie might find up there? And the third question is the one that changes everything. What does any of this have to do with a woman named Donna Macomb, Ellie's mother, who walked into those same mountains on an April morning in 1963 and never came back? Her disappearance was ruled an accident. The case was closed in 72 hours. No state investigator was ever called. No follow-up was ever conducted. And for 15 years, not a single person in Harlan Ridge said a word about it. To understand what happened to Ellie, we cannot start in 1978. We have to go back further. We have to go back to the spring of 1963, to the day her mother walked into the mountains and never came home. Harlan Ridge, West Virginia, sits in a narrow valley between 2 ridges of the Allegheny Mountains, about 90 miles southeast of Charleston. If you have never been to this part of Appalachia, it is difficult to explain how isolated it can feel. The mountains rise on either side like walls. The fog settles into the valley in the early morning and sometimes does not lift until noon. There is one road in and one road out, a 2-lane blacktop that winds along the river for 11 miles before it connects to the county highway. In 1978, there was no cell phone coverage because cell phones did not exist yet. There was a single payphone outside the general store. There was a party line telephone system, which meant that if you picked up the phone to make a call, there was a reasonable chance your neighbor was already on the line, listening to someone else's conversation. Privacy in Harlan Ridge was not a right. It was an illusion. The town had been built on coal. The first mine opened in 1902, and for 50 years, coal was the reason Harlan Ridge existed. Men went into the mountain in the morning and came out covered in black dust in the evening. The company owned the houses. The company owned the store. The company even owned the church building, though they let the congregation use it for free as long as nobody preached against the mining operation. By the 1960s, the mines were closing. The coal was running thin, and the companies were pulling out one by one. The young people left for Charleston or Pittsburgh or anywhere that had jobs. The people who stayed were the ones who could not leave or would not leave. They were bound to that valley by family, by stubbornness, by debt, or by secrets. And Harlan Ridge had plenty of secrets. The most powerful family in town was the Darnells. Harold Darnell had been the town council chairman since 1951. His family owned the largest remaining land parcels in the valley, more than 400 acres that bordered the Monongahela National Forest to the north and east. Harold was not a cruel man in the way that people usually mean when they say that. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten people openly. He simply made things happen. If Harold Darnell wanted a road paved, it got paved. If he wanted a business to get a permit, it got a permit. If he wanted a problem to go away, the problem went away. His brother-in-law, Vernon Cahill, was the county sheriff. His younger brother, Boyd Cahill, was the pastor at the Harlan Ridge Community Church. Between the Darnell family and the Cahill family, there was almost nothing in that town that happened without their knowledge or their approval. Remember these names. They are going to matter. Now let me tell you about Ray Macomb. Ray was a quiet man. He had fought in Korea. He came home with a purple heart and a limp that got worse in cold weather and a deep reluctance to talk about anything that had happened overseas. He worked in the mines until they closed. Then he took odd jobs, carpentry mostly, and he lived in a small frame house on the east side of town with a porch that faced the mountains. Ray read Louis L'Amour westerns in the evenings. He kept a vegetable garden. He went to church on Sundays but sat in the back and never sang the hymns. He was the kind of man that people respected without really knowing. The kind of man who never asked for anything and never explained himself. And in the spring of 1963, Ray Macomb became the sole guardian of his 2-year-old granddaughter, Ellie. Because Ellie's mother, Donna, was gone. The official story was simple. Donna Macomb, age 22, had gone hiking alone on the North Ridge Trail on the morning of April 3rd, 1963. She did this regularly. She knew the mountains better than almost anyone in town. She had been walking those trails since she was a child. But on that particular morning, Donna did not come home. A search party went out the next day. They found her jacket near a cliff edge on the upper trail, about 3 miles from the trailhead. The jacket was folded neatly on a rock. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken branches, no disturbed earth at the cliff edge, no blood. The county sheriff, Vernon Cahill, ruled it an accidental fall. The body was never recovered, which was not unusual in that terrain. The gorge below the cliff was deep, rocky, and choked with laurel thicket so dense that a person could walk past a fallen tree 10 feet away and never see it. The case was closed in 72 hours. No state investigators were ever called. Ray Macomb accepted the ruling. He had no evidence to contradict it. He had a 2-year-old granddaughter who needed him, and he had a town full of people who had already decided that the story was over. Ray told Ellie that her mother had died in a hiking accident. He told her that it was nobody's fault. He told her that her mother loved her very much. And for 15 years, that was the only version of the story that Ellie ever heard. She grew up in that small frame house on the east side of town. She went to the same school as every other child in Harlan Ridge. She was quiet, not shy exactly, but watchful. She had a habit of studying people the way some people study maps, carefully, patiently, as if she were trying to understand the terrain before she stepped onto it. Her teachers described her as bright but solitary. She did not have many friends. She did not seem to want many friends. What she wanted was the woods. From the time she was 7 or 8 years old, Ellie spent as much time in the mountains as Ray would allow. She knew the trails by name. She knew where the creeks ran high in spring and where the blackberries grew thickest in August. She knew the sound of a red-tailed hawk versus a Cooper's hawk. She knew which mushrooms were safe and which would kill you. The woods were not a hobby for Ellie Macomb. They were a language, and she spoke it fluently. But there was one thing about Ellie that made people uncomfortable, even before the wolves. She drew them constantly. In her school notebooks, on napkins at the diner, on the margins of her homework, wolves, always wolves. She drew them running, sleeping, standing on ridge lines, looking directly at the viewer with eyes that her art teacher once described as unsettlingly aware. Her teachers mentioned it to Ray. Ray nodded and said he would talk to her about it. He never did. Because Ray knew something that nobody else in that town was supposed to know. Donna had drawn wolves too. At the age of 12, Ellie began spending entire afternoons in the forest alone. She would leave the house after breakfast on a Saturday morning and not return until late afternoon. Ray worried, but he allowed it. She always came home before dark. She always came home safe. And she always came home with that particular look on her face, calm, settled, as if whatever restlessness lived inside her had been temporarily quieted by the trees. Then, when Ellie was 14, something happened that should have been a warning. A boy in her class named Tommy Darnell, Harold Darnell's grandson, told anyone who would listen that he had seen Ellie sitting in a clearing on the North Ridge with a wolf lying beside her. Not across the clearing, not watching from the tree line, beside her, like a dog beside its owner. Tommy said the wolf had its head resting on its front paws and Ellie had her hand on its back. Nobody believed Tommy. Tommy was 14 years old and known for telling stories. His father, Hank, told him to stop making things up. His teachers told him to focus on his schoolwork. The story was dismissed as a teenage boy's imagination, but Tommy Darnell was not making it up. And 2 years later, everyone in Harlan Ridge would find out exactly how real it was. In the spring of 1977, Ellie Macomb was 16 years old. She stood 5'6", with dark hair she kept in a single braid and her mother's gray eyes. She was not popular at school, but she was not bullied either. She existed in that middle space where people left her alone, and she returned the favor. On a Saturday morning in late March, Ellie hiked the North Ridge Trail alone, as she had done hundreds of times before. The snow was mostly gone, but the ground was still soft, and the trees had not yet leafed out. So the forest had that skeletal, open quality it gets in early spring when you can see further between the trunks than at any other time of year. She was about 2 miles up the trail when she heard it. Not a howl, a sound she had never heard before. A low, ragged whimper, almost inaudible, coming from somewhere off the trail to her left. She followed the sound for about 200 yards through the underbrush and found the source. A female timber wolf, full-grown, maybe 80 pounds, was caught in an old steel-jaw leg-hold trap. The trap was rusted almost orange. It had probably been set years ago, maybe decades ago, back when trapping was common in these mountains, and then forgotten. The wolf's left front paw was clamped in the jaws of the trap. The fur around the paw was matted with dried blood. The animal was lying on its side, breathing in shallow, rapid bursts, and its eyes were open but glassy with exhaustion. It had probably been there for at least a day, maybe two. Ellie stopped about 15 feet away. She did not run. She did not scream. She stood perfectly still and looked at the wolf, and the wolf looked at her. And then Ellie did something that no wildlife biologist, no animal behaviorist, no expert of any kind would ever recommend. She began to talk. Not commands. Not the high-pitched baby talk that people use with domestic animals. She spoke to the wolf in a low, steady, conversational tone, as if she were explaining something to a friend. She told the wolf that she was going to come closer. She told it that she was not going to hurt it. She told it that the trap was old and the spring was weak, and she thought she could open it if the wolf would let her try. She spoke continuously without raising her voice, without breaking eye contact, and she began walking forward, one step at a time. The wolf did not growl. It did not bare its teeth. It did not try to lunge. It lay still and watched her come. Ellie knelt beside the trap. She found a thick branch, wedged it into the jaw mechanism, and pried. The rusted spring resisted, then gave. The jaws opened. The wolf pulled its paw free. Ellie stepped back. The wolf stood slowly, tested the injured paw, and then turned its head and looked at Ellie for what she would later describe as a long time. Then it walked into the trees and disappeared. Ellie went home. She told no one. But 3 days later, she hiked back to the same trailhead, and on the flat rock where she always sat to lace up her boots before starting the climb, she found a dead rabbit. Freshly killed, cleanly done, no human tracks anywhere around it. Now there are explanations for this. A hawk could have dropped it. A fox could have abandoned it. A hunter could have left it. But Ellie did not believe any of those explanations, and what happened over the following months made those explanations increasingly difficult to maintain. Because the wolves began to appear, not all at once, not dramatically. It happened gradually, the way trust builds between any two creatures that are learning each other's boundaries. The female she had freed, the one Ellie came to call Gray, was the first. Ellie would be hiking the North Ridge, and Gray would appear on the trail ahead of her, standing at a distance watching. Then Gray would move off the trail and walk parallel to Ellie through the trees, maintaining maybe 30 yards of separation, then 20 yards, then 10. By midsummer of 1977, Gray was walking beside Ellie on the trail as if they had been doing it their entire lives. Then the others came. A large with a dark face that Ellie called Bishop, a younger, more nervous wolf she called Runner, a female with a torn left ear she called Nell. One by one, the members of the pack began to tolerate Ellie's presence, and then to accept it, and then to something that looked very much like welcoming it. Ellie would sit on a fallen log in the meadow behind the old sawmill, a clearing about a mile and a half up the North Ridge, and the wolves would settle around her, not touching her, not always, but near her, resting, watching the tree line, occasionally making eye contact with her in that steady, unblinking way that wolves have, a look that most humans interpret as a threat, but that between pack members is something closer to acknowledgement. You are here, I see you, we are the same. By the fall of 1977, Ellie Macomb was spending 3 or 4 afternoons a week in the company of a wild wolf pack in the mountains above Harlan Ridge. She kept it secret. She did not tell Ray. She did not tell her teachers. She did not tell anyone. She understood, in the way that a person raised in a small town understands certain things without being told, that what she was doing would not be accepted, that it would not be understood, that it would frighten people. She was right about all of that, but she could not have predicted how badly it would go. Because in October of 1977, Tommy Darnell saw her again. This time, Tommy was not alone. He had brought his older brother, Dale, to prove that he was not making things up. The two of them crouched behind a deadfall at the edge of the sawmill meadow and watched as Ellie sat cross-legged in the grass, surrounded by 4 timber wolves. One of them, the big male she called Bishop, was lying close enough to her that his flank was touching her knee. Dale Darnell was 20 years old. He had hunted these mountains since he was 12. He had never seen a wild wolf allow a human being within 50 feet, let alone make physical contact. He watched for about 10 minutes, then he grabbed Tommy by the arm and they backed away as quietly as they could. Dale did not go home. He went straight to his father's house. Hank Darnell listened to his son's account. He asked Dale to repeat it. He asked Dale if he was sure. Dale was sure. And Hank Darnell picked up the phone and called a meeting of the town council. In a town of 340 people, news does not travel, it detonates. Within a week of Dale Darnell's account reaching the town council, every person in Harlan Ridge knew about Ellie Macomb and the wolves. The story changed slightly with each retelling, the way stories do when they pass through enough mouths. By the time it reached the far end of town, Ellie was not just sitting with the wolves. She was commanding them. She was feeding them. She was sending them on errands. The truth, which was strange enough on its own, became buried under layers of exaggeration and fear. But the reaction was not uniform. 2 camps formed, and the divide between them would tear the town apart over the following year. The first camp, led informally by Hank Darnell, believed that something was genuinely wrong. Not supernatural, not mystical, but wrong, in the way that a person who handles venomous snakes or keeps a pet cougar is wrong. These were wild animals, apex predators. An 80-pound timber wolf can bring down a 200-pound deer. The idea that a 16-year-old girl was spending unsupervised time in the middle of a wolf pack was, to these people, a public safety crisis. Hank Darnell was not a superstitious man. He was a practical man. He raised cattle. He sat on the town council. He paid his taxes. And he wanted the wolves removed from the mountain and Ellie Macomb kept out of the forest, by force if necessary. The second camp, smaller and quieter, thought the whole thing was overblown. Wolves had been in those mountains forever. They had never attacked a person. Ellie was an odd girl. Sure, but odd was not dangerous. Let her be. This camp did not have a leader, because in Harlan Ridge, going against Hank Darnell required a kind of courage that most people reserved for more pressing matters, like putting food on the table and keeping the furnace running through winter. But there was a third group, and this group did not speak publicly at all. This group consisted of the older residents, the ones who remembered 1963, the ones who remembered Donna Macomb. And when they heard about Ellie and the wolves, they did not feel fear or curiosity. They felt dread, because they knew something that the younger generation did not. They knew that this had happened before. Donna Macomb had walked with the wolves too, and Donna Macomb was dead. Reverend Boyd Cahill was the first to make the connection publicly, though he did it carefully. His sermons that November began to reference themes of dominion, of the natural order, of the boundary between the human world and the animal world, and what happens when that boundary is crossed. He never said Ellie's name from the pulpit. He did not need to. Everyone knew who he was talking about. And the word he never used, the word that hung in the air of that church like smoke, was the word that would eventually be painted on Ray Macomb's mailbox in red letters. Which, Ray Macomb was not a man who frightened easily. He had survived Korea. He had survived the mines. He had survived the loss of his daughter. But when he heard what people were saying about Ellie, something shifted behind his eyes. He sat Ellie down at the kitchen table one evening in late November and told her, firmly and without explanation, that she was no longer allowed to go into the forest alone. Ellie asked why. Ray looked at her for a long time. Then he said something that she would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "This town will make you pay for being different. I have seen it before." Ellie asked what he meant. Ray shook his head and stood up from the table. He would not say more. And Ellie, who had spent her entire life reading the silences between people's words, understood that her grandfather was not just worried. He was terrified, not of the wolves, of the town. But Ellie did not stop going into the mountains. She went less frequently. She was more careful. She took different routes to the trailhead. She checked behind her before she entered the tree line. But she did not stop, because by that point, the wolves were not just animals she visited. They were the only part of her life that made complete sense. The only place where she did not feel watched, judged, or misunderstood. In the meadow, with Gray lying beside her and Bishop standing guard at the tree line, and Runner chasing his own shadow through the tall grass, Ellie Macomb felt something she had never felt anywhere else. She felt like she belonged, and she was not willing to give that up, not for Hank Darnell, not for Reverend Cahill, not even for Ray. That decision, that refusal to surrender, the one thing that made her feel whole, would set in motion everything that followed. December of 1977 brought the first hard freeze to Harlan Ridge, and with it, the wolves changed their behavior. For years, the pack had stayed high on the ridges, visible only to hikers and hunters who ventured deep into the backcountry. But that December, they began appearing closer to town. Not in town, not on the streets or in the yards, but at the tree line where the forest ended and the cleared land began. A farmer named Bill Sykes saw two of them standing at the edge of his pasture at dawn, watching his cattle. They did not approach. They did not make any aggressive move. They simply stood there, two gray shapes in the morning mist, and then they turned and disappeared back into the trees. The next week, a woman named Carol Patterson saw a wolf crossing the old logging road behind the elementary school at 3 in the afternoon. Again, no aggression, no threat, just a wolf, walking calmly across the road and vanishing into the brush. But the sightings were enough. In a town already on edge, the wolves' proximity to homes and schools was gasoline on a fire that was already burning. What made it worse, what made it so much worse, was the pattern. The wolves appeared most often in areas where Ellie had recently been. If she walked to the general store, wolves would be spotted near the road she took. If she sat on Ray's porch in the evening, a howl would rise from the ridge directly above the house, as if something up there was keeping track of her. The people of Harlan Ridge were not wildlife biologists. They did not understand pack territory dynamics or denning behavior or the dozen other ecological factors that might explain why wolves were moving to lower elevations that winter. What they understood was what they saw. The wolves followed the girl. The girl attracted the wolves. Remove the girl, and the wolves would go back to where they belonged. Then, in the second week of January 1978, Hank Darnell lost 3 sheep. He found them on a Monday morning, dead in the east pasture. The kills were clean, efficient, unmistakably the work of a predator that knew exactly what it was doing. Wolf tracks surrounded the carcasses. Hank Darnell stood in that pasture with the wind cutting through his coat and the blood soaking into the frozen ground. And something hardened inside him. He had been patient. He had been reasonable. He had let the council debate and the reverend preach and the old-timers whisper. But this was his livelihood. This was his property, and he was done waiting. Hank went to the county seat the next day and applied for a wolf depredation permit. Given the livestock losses, it was granted within the week. He had legal authority to kill any wolf found within a certain radius of his property. He assembled a hunting party. His brother Carl, who was an experienced tracker, 2 other men from town, both good shots. They had rifles. They had the permit. They had every legal right to do what they were about to do. And they had the support of most of the town behind them. But Ray Macomb did not support it. At a council meeting that Thursday evening, Ray stood up and argued against the hunt. He pointed out that wolves had been in these mountains for as long as anyone could remember. That livestock losses, while unfortunate, were part of living in wild country. That killing the pack would not solve anything, because another pack would eventually move in to fill the territory. His argument was logical, it was measured, it was ignored. Hank Darnell responded to Ray's argument with 6 words that landed in that room like a grenade. He said, "The problem is not the wolves, Ray. It is your granddaughter." The room went silent. Ray stared at Hank across the council table. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Ray picked up his coat and walked out of the meeting without another word. He did not slam the door. He did not raise his voice. He simply left. And that silence, that controlled, deliberate silence, frightened the people in that room more than any outburst would have, because they knew Ray Macomb. And they knew that when Ray went quiet, it meant he had stopped negotiating. The hunting party went into the mountains on a Saturday morning in late January. Hank and Carl Darnell, plus the 2 other men, carrying rifles and wearing blaze orange and moving through the forest with the quiet efficiency of men who had hunted these ridges their entire lives. They knew the terrain. They knew where the pack had been spotted. They followed the tracks up the North Ridge trail toward the sawmill meadow, which had become the wolves' most frequent gathering point. It took them about 2 hours to reach the clearing, and when they got there, they found exactly what they expected. The wolves were there, 6 of them, spread across the meadow in the relaxed, loose formation of a pack that feels safe in its territory. The men set up positions at the edge of the tree line. Carl Darnell, who was the best shot in the group, braced his rifle against a birch trunk and lined up on the big male, the one Ellie called Bishop. He controlled his breathing the way his father had taught him. He put the crosshairs on the wolf's shoulder, and he fired. The shot missed, not by much, but enough. The bullet hit the frozen ground 2 feet in front of Bishop and threw up a spray of dirt and ice. What happened next is something that every man in that hunting party would remember for the rest of his life. The wolves did not run. In every hunting experience these men had ever had, the sound of a rifle shot sent every animal within a quarter mile into panicked flight. Deer bolted, turkey scattered. Even bears, 700-pound bears, would turn and crash through the underbrush at the sound of a gunshot. The wolves did not move. They stood up from where they had been resting, and they turned to face the direction the shot had come from. And they held their ground, 6 wolves in a line, facing 4 men with rifles. And then, from the trees behind the wolves, Ellie Macomb walked into the clearing. She was not running. She was not screaming. She was not crying. She walked into that meadow with the unhurried, deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She walked past the wolves. She walked past Bishop, who was standing rigid with his ears forward and his hackles raised. She walked to the center of the clearing, and she stopped, directly between the hunting party and the pack. She stood there with her arms at her sides, and she looked at the 4 men at the edge of the tree line. She did not say a word. She did not need to. The wolves rearranged themselves behind her, not randomly, not in a panicked cluster. They moved into a formation, a loose semicircle with Ellie at the front, and they faced the hunters. Hank by Darnell would later describe it to the council in a voice that people said they had never heard from him before. A voice that was not angry, but shaken. He said, "Those wolves move behind her like soldiers falling in behind a general. I have hunted these mountains for 30 years. I have never seen anything like it. I have never seen anything close to it." The men lowered their rifles, not because Ellie told them to, not because they were afraid of the wolves, though they were. They lowered their rifles because they could not shoot the wolves without risking hitting the girl. And whatever Hank Darnell thought about Ellie Macomb, he was not going to shoot a 16-year-old. The men backed away. They returned to town. They told the council what happened. And from that day forward, the conversation in Harlan Ridge was no longer about the wolves. It was about Ellie, because what they had seen in that clearing was not a girl who happened to be near some wolves. What they had seen was something that defied every rule they understood about the natural world. And when human beings encounter something they cannot explain, they have 2 choices. They can try to understand it, or they can try to destroy it. Harlan Ridge chose the second option. February 1978. Ellie Macomb was pulled out of school. The official reason given by the school board was concern for her safety and the safety of other students. The real reason was that 6 parents had threatened to pull their own children if Ellie remained enrolled. The principal, a man named Donald Weaver, called Ray to deliver the news. Ray asked if Ellie had ever threatened anyone. The answer was no. Ray asked if Ellie had ever brought a weapon to school. The answer was no. Ray asked if Ellie had ever behaved in any way that was violent, disruptive, or dangerous to any student or teacher at any point in her 11 years of attendance. The answer was no. Then Ray asked on what grounds exactly his granddaughter was being removed. There was a long pause. And then Donald Weaver said something that revealed more about the state of Harlan Ridge in that moment than any council meeting or sermon ever could. He said, "Ray, people are scared. I am sorry. That is the best I can do." Ray hung up the phone. Things accelerated after that. Reverend Cahill delivered a sermon in mid-February titled Wolves Among the Flock. He spoke about the importance of protecting the community from influences that would undermine the natural order. He spoke about the responsibility of good people to recognize when something in their midst was not right, even if that something wore a familiar face. He spoke for 45 minutes. He never said Ellie's name. He did not have to. The following week, someone painted the word witch on Ray Macomb's mailbox in red paint. Ray found it at 6 in the morning. He scrubbed it off with turpentine and steel wool before Ellie woke up. He did not report it. He did not mention it to anyone. He simply cleaned it off and went about his day. But his hands were shaking when he did it, and that was something that had not happened to Ray Macomb since Korea. The town librarian, a woman named June Phelps, came to Ray's house after dark one evening in late February. June was in her mid-50s, a widow, quiet, well-read, and one of the few people in Harlan Ridge who had always been kind to Ellie. She had let Ellie spend entire afternoons in the library. She had recommended books to her. She had never once made Ellie feel strange or unwelcome. And now June was standing on Ray's porch with her coat buttoned to her chin and her eyes full of something that Ray recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who was about to deliver news they wished they did not have. June told Ray what she had heard. Hank Darnell and Reverend Cahill had been in contact with the county mental health office. They were building a case for involuntary commitment. They wanted Ellie evaluated at the state's psychiatric hospital in Weston. They were arguing that her behavior with the wolves constituted evidence of a delusional disorder, that she was a danger to herself and possibly to others, that she required institutional intervention. Ray listened without interrupting. When June finished, he asked who else was involved. June said the whole council. She said they had already contacted the county. She said the paperwork was being prepared. Ray stood on his porch in the cold and looked out at the dark ridgeline above his house. Then he said 4 words that June Phelps would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "Over my dead body." To understand what happened next, we have to go back to Donna Macomb. We have to go back to 1963 and ask the question that should have been asked 30 years earlier. What really happened to Ellie's mother? The official story, as I told you earlier, was that Donna went hiking on the North Ridge Trail and fell from a cliff. Accidental death, case closed. But there were problems with that story. Problems that nobody at the time had the courage or the motivation to point out. Donna Macomb was an experienced hiker. She had walked the North Ridge Trail hundreds of times. The section of trail near the cliff was not particularly narrow or treacherous. She knew every rock, every root, every spot where the footing got tricky. The idea that she simply slipped and fell was, to anyone who knew her, difficult to accept. Then there was the jacket. Donna's jacket was found on a rock near the cliff edge, but it was not crumpled or torn or thrown aside in panic. It was folded, neatly, deliberately, placed on the rock as if someone had set it there with care. People who are falling off cliffs do not fold their jackets first. The case was handled entirely by Sheriff Vernon Cahill. No state police were involved. No outside investigators were consulted. Vernon ruled it an accident within 72 hours, which is an extraordinarily short timeline for a death investigation, especially one in which no body was recovered. And Vernon Cahill was Harold Darnell's brother-in-law. They were not just related, they were close. They hunted together. Their families shared holidays. Their interests were aligned in every way that mattered. None of this was questioned at the time, because in Harlan Ridge in 1963, questioning Vernon Cahill was the same as questioning Harold Darnell. And nobody questioned Harold Darnell. But Donna Macomb had left something behind, something that Ray found when he cleaned out her room after she was declared dead. A journal, a simple composition notebook with a marbled black and white cover, the kind you could buy at any general store for 35 cents. Donna had kept it for about 2 years, from 1961 to 1963. Most of the entries were ordinary, notes about Ellie's first steps, grocery lists, observations about the weather. But scattered among those mundane entries were others, entries about the wolves. Donna described encounters in the mountains that were remarkably similar to what Ellie would experience 15 years later. She wrote about a female wolf that allowed her to approach. She wrote about sitting in the meadow near the sawmill and watching the pack interact. She wrote about the feeling she had when she was with them, a feeling she described as being understood without having to explain herself. And in the final pages of the journal, the entries changed. They became shorter, more urgent, more afraid. The second to last entry, dated April 1st, 1963, 2 days before Donna disappeared, read as follows. They told me to stop going up there. HD said if I do not stop, they will make me stop. Ray says I am imagining things. I am not imagining things, HD Harold Darnell. Ray had read that entry in 1963. He had read it and understood exactly what it meant. And he had done nothing, not because he did not care, not because he was a coward, but because he had a 2-year-old granddaughter, and Harold Darnell controlled the town, and Vernon Cahill controlled the law, and Ray Macomb was one man with a bad leg and no evidence beyond a dead woman's journal. So he locked the journal in a trunk in the attic. He buried his suspicions alongside his grief, and he raised Ellie in silence, hoping that if he kept her close enough and quiet enough, the past would stay buried. For 15 years it did. March of 1978. Ellie had been out of school for a month. She was confined to the house most of the time, venturing out only for groceries or to sit on the porch when the weather allowed. Ray had become more protective than ever, checking the locks twice before bed, watching the road from the kitchen window, jumping at sounds he would have ignored a year earlier. Ellie knew something was wrong beyond what she could see. She knew it the way she knew things about the wolves. Not through information, but through attention. She could feel the weight of what Ray was carrying. She could see it in the way he moved, slower now, heavier, as if the secret inside him had physical mass. One afternoon, while Ray was in town picking up supplies, Ellie went into the attic. She had been up there before, many times, looking through old boxes of Christmas decorations, and her mother's clothes, and the accumulated debris of decades of living in one place. But she had never opened the locked trunk in the corner. It was an old military footlocker with Ray's name, stenciled on the side, and a combination padlock on the latch. Ellie had never asked about it. She had assumed it contained things from Korea that Ray did not want to revisit. But on that afternoon, with the house empty and the weight of everything pressing down on her, she decided to open it. She picked the lock with a hairpin. It was a skill she had learned from a book on lock mechanisms that June Phelps had special ordered for the library at Ellie's request 2 years earlier, a small detail that would have seemed meaningless at the time, but that now feels like the kind of quiet preparation that fate sometimes arranges without telling anyone. Inside the trunk, beneath Ray's service medals and a folded American flag and a stack of letters from Korea, Ellie found the journal. She sat on the attic floor with the afternoon light coming through the small window, and she read every page. She read her mother's descriptions of the wolves. She read about the meadow and the trails and the feeling of being understood. She read about the encounters that mirrored her own so precisely that it felt less like reading a dead woman's words and more like reading a transcript of her own life. And then she reached the final entries, the fear, the threats, HD, the warning that was not a warning but a promise. She closed the journal and sat in the attic for a long time. When Ray came home, Ellie was sitting at the kitchen table with the journal open in front of her. Ray saw it and stopped in the doorway. He set the grocery bags on the counter without looking at them. He pulled out the chair across from Ellie and sat down. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Ellie asked a question. She asked, "Did they kill her?" Ray closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. He said, "I do not know for certain. I have never known for certain. But I believe they did." He told her everything. He told her about the journal, about Harold Darnell's threats, about Vernon Cahill's 72-hour investigation, about the folded jacket on the rock, about the body that was never found. He told her that he had spent 15 years carrying the weight of what he believed had happened, and that he had kept it from her because he thought silence was the only thing that could protect her. He told her he was sorry. He told her he should have done more. He told her he should have fought harder. Ellie listened to all of it. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. When Ray finished, she said one thing. She said, "They killed her because she tried to protect the wolves, and now they want to lock me up for the same thing." Ray could not argue with that. Because it was true, that night, Ray offered Ellie a way out. He had a sister in Ohio, a woman named Mabel who lived outside Columbus, and who had always said that if Ray ever needed anything, she was there. Ray told Ellie they could leave. Pack the truck, drive through the night, be in Ohio by morning, start over. Leave the wolves, leave the town, leave the journal, leave all of it behind. Ellie could finish high school in Columbus. She could have a normal life. She could forget Harlan Ridge and everything that happened here. Ellie sat with that offer for a long time. She looked at Ray, at this man who had given up 15 years of his life to raise her, who had swallowed his grief and his suspicions and his rage to keep her safe, who was now offering to uproot the only life he had ever known to protect her one more time. And she said no. She told Ray that she was not going to run. She said she was going to take the journal to the state police. She was going to reopen her mother's case. She was going to make sure that what happened to Donna Macomb did not stay buried in Harlan Ridge forever. Ray told her it was dangerous. He told her the Darnells would not let it happen without a fight. He told her that she was 17 years old, and she was going up against people who had controlled this town for 30 years. Ellie said she understood. She said she was going anyway. Ray looked at his granddaughter across that kitchen table, and for the first time in 15 years, he saw Donna looking back at him. The same gray eyes, the same steady calm, the same refusal to bend. And Ray Macomb, who had chosen silence in 1963 because he thought it was the safest option, made a different choice this time. He said, "Then I am going with you." June Phelps agreed to drive them. She had a car that was more reliable than Ray's truck. And more importantly, she had a cousin who worked at the county courthouse in Charleston and who could make sure the journal reached the right people. They planned to leave at 6 in the morning before anyone in town was awake. They would drive to the county seat, hand the journal to the state police, and let the law take over from there. June arrived at Ray's house at 5:45 on the morning of November 14th, 1978. The sky was still dark. The air was freezing. Ellie had the journal in a canvas bag over her shoulder. Ray had his coat on and his truck keys in his pocket as a backup. They were ready. But Hank Darnell had friends at the telephone exchange. In a town where the phone lines were shared and the walls were thin and loyalty ran along family lines like water runs along cracks in a foundation, there were no secrets. At least, not the kind that Ellie and Ray and June were trying to keep. They saw the headlights before they reached the end of the road. Two trucks parked across the blacktop at the intersection where Ray's road met the main highway out of town. Hank Darnell was standing in front of the first truck. Carl Darnell was leaning against the second. 5 other men stood behind them, including 2 members of the town council and a man who worked for the county road crew. 7 men, blocking the only road out of Harlan Ridge. June stopped the car about 30 yards from the barricade. She left the engine running. Ray told Ellie to stay in the car. Ellie did not stay in the car. She got out, walked past Ray, and stood in the road facing Hank Darnell. She was holding the canvas bag with the journal inside it. Hank told her she was not leaving town. He told her the county mental health evaluators were arriving at noon. He told her that the best thing she could do for herself and for her grandfather was to go home, cooperate with the evaluation, and let the adults handle things from here. His tone was not threatening. It was controlled, measured, the tone of a man who believed he was doing the right thing. Ellie asked Hank if he knew what was in the bag. Hank said he did not know and did not care. Ellie told him it was her mother's journal. She told him it contained entries that described threats made by his father, Harold Darnell, against Donna Macomb in the weeks before her death. She told him that she was taking the journal to the state police and that they were going to reopen the investigation into her mother's disappearance. The road went very quiet. Hank Darnell's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The other men glanced at each other. Carl Darnell took his hands out of his pockets. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, and everyone standing on that road felt it. Ellie told June to go, not to the county seat, to Ray's house, to get Ray, who had fallen behind when Ellie walked ahead. June hesitated. Ellie told her again more firmly, "Go get my grandfather." June turned the car around and drove back toward Ray's house. Ellie was alone on the road with 7 men. She was 17 years old. She weighed maybe 120 pounds. She had no weapon, she had no phone, she had no one, and then the howling started. It came from the ridge above town first. A single long, rising howl that split the pre-dawn darkness like a crack in glass. Then another howl answered from the south, from the direction of the old hollow where the creek ran down to the river. Then a third from the east, from the meadow behind the sawmill. Then a fourth, then a fifth. The sound surrounded the town. It came from every direction. It echoed off the mountains, filled the valley, until there was no silence left anywhere. The men on the road stopped moving. They stopped talking. They stood perfectly still and listened to the sound of something that was no longer distant, no longer abstract, no longer a topic for council meetings and Sunday sermons. The wolves were coming. They emerged from the tree line on the north side of the road, 6 of them, Gray in the lead, moving with that fluid, unhurried gait that wolves have when they are not hunting and not fleeing, but simply going where they intend to go. Bishop behind her and to the right, Runner on the left, Nell and 2 others fanning out to either side. They walked down the slope toward the road. They did not run. They did not growl. They did not bare their teeth. They walked with the calm, absolute certainty of animals that have no doubt about what they are doing or why. The men backed up, Step by step, they retreated down the road toward the town square, because the town square was the nearest open space, and because human beings under threat instinctively seek open ground. The wolves followed, maintaining the same distance, never closing in, never falling back, and Ellie walked with them. She walked in the center of the pack, surrounded by 6 timber wolves, barefoot because she had lost her shoes on the gravel road, moving through the freezing dark toward the center of Harlan Ridge. By the time they reached the town square, lights were on in every house. People were at their windows. 340 citizens of Harlan Ridge watched as a 17-year-old girl stood in the middle of their town, surrounded by wolves, and waited. She was not afraid. She was not aggressive. She was not performing. She was simply standing there, in the one place where the entire town could see her, with the only allies she had ever had arranged around her like a living shield. And she was smiling, because for the first time in her life, Ellie Macomb was not hiding. She was not running. She was not pretending to be something. She was not in order to make other people comfortable. She was standing exactly where she was, exactly as she was, and daring the town to do something about it. The men retreated into the general store and locked the door. Someone called the county sheriff's office, and then everyone waited. The county sheriff arrived 2 hours later with 3 deputies and a state wildlife officer. By the time they reached the town square, the wolves were gone. They had disappeared back into the mountains as quietly as they had come, leaving nothing behind except tracks in the frost and a town full of people who would never entirely agree on what they had witnessed. Ellie was sitting on the bench outside the post office waiting. Ray was beside her. June Phelps was in her car across the street with the engine running, just in case. The wildlife officer's name was Frank Harlan. He was a Vietnam veteran in his mid-30s with a crew cut, and a no-nonsense manner that suggested he had very little patience for small-town politics. He approached Ellie and Ray and asked them what was going on. Ellie handed him the canvas bag. Inside was her mother's journal. She told Frank everything. She told him about Donna, about the wolves, about Harold Darnell's threats, about Vernon Cahill's 72-hour investigation, about the folded jacket, about the 15 years of silence. Frank Harlan read the journal on the hood of his truck, while the November wind whipped the pages. He read every entry. He read the final pages twice, then he walked over to his radio and made a call. He did not call the county sheriff's office. He called the state police barracks in Charleston. Within 48 hours, a state police investigator named Tom Draper arrived in Harlan Ridge. Tom Draper was not from Harlan Ridge. He had no family there. He had no connections there. He had no reason to protect anyone there. He was a 12-year veteran of the West Virginia State Police, and he had spent most of his career investigating cases that local authorities had either bungled or deliberately buried. He was exactly the kind of person that Harlan Ridge had spent 15 years trying to avoid. Draper began his investigation by doing something that Vernon Cahill had never done. He interviewed people outside the Darnell and Cahill families. He talked to old-timers who had known Donna. He talked to people who had been on the search party in 1963. He talked to the retired county coroner who had signed off on the accidental death ruling without ever examining a body, because there was no body to examine. And he found cracks in the story. He found a former mine worker named Glenn Hobbs, who told him that on the night of April 3rd, 1963, he had seen Harold Darnell's truck parked at the North Ridge trailhead at 11 o'clock at night. Glenn had not thought much of it at the time. Harold often went into the mountains at odd hours. He was known to check his timber stands and his property lines at all hours, but Glenn remembered it because of the timing. It was the same night Donna Macomb disappeared, and Glenn had noticed something else. There was a second vehicle at the trailhead, Vernon Cahill's patrol car. Draper also found something in the county records that had been overlooked or ignored for 15 years. In 1962, Harold Darnell had applied for a federal permit to log 200 acres of mountain land that bordered the national forest. The permit was denied. The reason for the denial was a habitat assessment filed with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that identified the area as critical range for the eastern timber wolf, a species that was already declining across Appalachia, and that the federal government was beginning to protect. The habitat assessment was unsigned, which was unusual, but Draper tracked it to its source through filing records and internal memos. The person who had submitted the habitat data to the Fish and Wildlife Service was a local resident who had spent months documenting wolf activity in the mountains. Her name was Donna Macomb. Harold Darnell's logging permit was worth, by some estimates, several $100,000 in timber revenue. In a town where the median household income was under $8,000 a year, that was not just money. It was power. It was legacy. It was the difference between the Darnell family remaining the most important family in Harlan Ridge and becoming just another family struggling to get by in a dying coal town. And Donna Macomb, a 22-year-old mother with a journal full of wolf observations and a quiet determination to protect the mountains she loved, had taken it all away with a single filing. The state investigation took 4 months. When it was finished, Tom Draper presented his findings to the county prosecutor. The full details of what the investigation uncovered were never made entirely public because some of the witnesses were deceased and some of the evidence was circumstantial. But what became known was enough to reshape the history of Harlan Ridge forever. The investigation concluded that Donna Macomb did not die in an accidental fall. The evidence pointed toward a confrontation on the North Ridge Trail on the night of April 3, 1963, involving Harold Darnell and at least one other individual. The precise circumstances of Donna's death could not be determined with certainty because her body was never recovered. But the investigation found that the original death ruling by Sheriff Vernon Cahill was, at minimum, grossly negligent and, more likely, a deliberate act of obstruction designed to protect Harold Darnell from scrutiny. Harold Darnell was dead by 1978. He had died of a heart attack in 1971, 7 years before Ellie stood in the town square with the wolves. He never faced charges. He never faced questions. He went to his grave with the secret intact, or so he believed. Vernon Cahill was still alive. He was retired and living in a small house on the county line, about 20 miles from Harlan Ridge. When Tom Draper arrived at his door with the journal and the filing records, and Glenn Hobbs's testimony about the truck at the trailhead, Vernon Cahill sat down in his kitchen chair and did not speak for nearly 5 minutes. Then he confessed. He told Draper that Harold Darnell had confronted Donna on the trail. He told Draper that things had escalated. He told Draper that he had helped conceal what happened afterward because Harold was family and because he believed, or told himself he believed, that it had been an accident. Whether that last part was true, Vernon could not say. He had told himself the story so many times that the truth and the lie had become indistinguishable, even to him. Vernon Cahill was charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy to obstruct a death investigation. He pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 3 years in state prison. He served 18 months. Hank Darnell, Harold's son, was charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice for his role in perpetuating the cover-up as an adult. The case against Hank was more complex because he had been 12 years old when Donna died and had no direct involvement in the original events. But as an adult, he had actively worked to silence anyone who raised questions about the case, had used his position on the town council to intimidate Ellie Macomb, and had led the effort to have Ellie committed to a psychiatric facility, an effort that the state investigation characterized as an attempt to discredit and remove the one person who was most likely to uncover the truth. Hank Darnell was convicted. He was sentenced to 2 years. He served 14 months. Reverend Boyd Cahill left Harlan Ridge before charges could be discussed. He relocated to a town in southern Virginia and never returned. He was never prosecuted. There were others in the town who had known or suspected the truth about Donna Macomb's death and had said nothing. They were not charged. The law does not punish silence, even when silence is its own kind of crime. And so the justice that came to Harlan Ridge was real but incomplete, the way justice often is. It punished some of the guilty. It left others untouched. It answered some questions and left others open. And it could not undo 15 years of lies, or give Ellie back the mother she had never known, or erase the word that someone had painted on Ellie Macomb's mailbox in the dark. Ellie Macomb left Harlan Ridge in the spring of 1979. She was 18 years old. She moved to Ohio with Ray, who was in declining health. His bad leg had gotten worse, and the stress of the previous 2 years had aged him in ways that went beyond the physical. He walked slower, he spoke less. He spent long hours on the porch of his sister Mabel's house outside Columbus, looking at a horizon that was flat and open and nothing at all like the ridgelines of West Virginia. Ray Macomb died in 1983. He was 61 years old. The death certificate said heart failure. But Ellie would later tell someone that her grandfather's heart had not failed. It had simply been carrying too much for too long. Ellie finished high school in Columbus. She graduated near the top of her class. She enrolled at Ohio State University and studied wildlife biology, a choice that surprised no one who knew her story and everyone who did not. She earned her bachelor's degree in 1984 and her master's degree in 1986, with a thesis on pack social dynamics in gray wolves. She was hired by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 1987, the same federal agency that her mother had contacted 24 years earlier to protect the wolves of Harlan Ridge. She spent 22 years with the service working in Montana, Wyoming, Minnesota, and Idaho. She tracked wolves. She studied their behavior. She contributed to research that informed federal wolf recovery programs across the northern Rockies. She was, by all professional accounts, a careful, dedicated, and exceptionally skilled wildlife biologist. But there were things about Ellie's career that her colleagues noticed, things they did not talk about in official reports, but mentioned quietly among themselves. Field teams that included Ellie reported fewer instances of wolves fleeing from observation. Wolves in her study areas seemed calmer, more tolerant of human presence, more likely to remain in sight long enough for meaningful data collection. One colleague, a field biologist named David Chen, described working with Ellie in the Lamar Valley of Yellowstone in 1996. He said that during a routine observation session, a female wolf from the Druid Peak Pack approached their position to within about 40 feet, looked directly at Ellie for several seconds, and then lay down in the grass and went to sleep. David had been studying wolves for 8 years. He had never seen a wild wolf behave that way near a human being. He asked Ellie about it later. She smiled and said she was just easy to be around. She never spoke publicly about what happened in Harlan Ridge. She never claimed any special ability. She never wrote a book or gave an interview or tried to profit from her story. She simply did her work, quietly and competently, in the mountains and forests of the American West, surrounded by the animals she had loved since before she could remember why. And what about the wolves? The pack that had roamed the ridges above Harlan Ridge for as long as anyone could remember, the pack that had tolerated a young woman's presence and then defended her when she needed it most. What happened to them? The answer is that nobody knows for certain. After the night of November 14th, 1978, the wolves of Harlan Ridge were never seen again. Not by hunters, not by hikers, not by the wildlife surveys that the state conducted in the 1980s as part of a broader assessment of predator populations in the Alleghenies. The pack simply vanished. Their territory, the meadows and ridgelines and creek bottoms they had inhabited for generations, was empty. No tracks, no scat, no howling in the night. It was as if they had never been there at all. There are several possible explanations. The pack may have relocated to deeper wilderness in response to the human activity and conflict that had disrupted their territory over the preceding year. Wolves are adaptive. They move when an area becomes too dangerous or too disturbed. The pack may have fragmented, with individual animals dispersing to join other packs in more remote areas of the Alleghenies or beyond. Or the pack may have simply reached the end of its natural lifespan. Wolf packs are not permanent structures. They form, they thrive, they age, they dissolve. A pack that loses its breeding pair can collapse within a single season. Any of these explanations is plausible. None of them is certain. But a retired fish and wildlife field biologist named Margaret Cole, who had worked in the Appalachian region in the early 1980s, offered a different perspective when she was interviewed years later. She said wolves do not vanish. They move on when there is nothing left to protect. She was not being mystical. She was being practical. But the sentence stayed with the people who heard it, the way certain sentences do when they contain more truth than their words can hold. Harlan Ridge still exists. The population has continued to decline. The last census counted fewer than 200 residents. The general store closed in 1992. The church where Reverend Cahill once preached about wolves among the flock is still standing, but services are held only twice a month now, led by a pastor who drives in from the county seat because there is no resident minister. The Darnell family still owns land there, but Hank Darnell's children moved away years ago. The old sawmill meadow where Ellie sat with the wolves has been reclaimed by the forest. The grass is gone, replaced by young tulip poplars and white oaks that have grown up in the decades since anyone cleared that land. If you hiked up there today, you would not know that anything had ever happened in that clearing. The mountain keeps its own records and it does not share them easily. This story was never about a girl who could talk to wolves. It was about a town that could not talk to each other. It was about what happens when a community decides that silence is safer than truth, when loyalty to the powerful becomes more important than justice for the powerless, when the people who are supposed to protect you are the same people you need protection from. Ellie Macomb tried to protect something she loved, and she was destroyed for it. 15 years later, her daughter tried to do the same thing, and this time, the truth came out. Not because the system worked, not because justice was inevitable. It came out because a 17-year-old girl refused to be silent. because an old man finally chose courage over caution, because a librarian drove to a house in the dark, and because 6 wolves walked down a mountain and stood between a girl and the men who wanted to erase her, the same way they had failed to stand for her mother 15 years before. The wolves were never the danger. They never were. The danger was always human. It was always about power and money and the terrible things that ordinary people will do when they believe that their way of life is threatened. Hank Darnell was not a monster. Vernon Cahill was not a villain from a storybook. They were ordinary men who made choices, one after another, year after year, until the weight of those choices became so heavy that they could not put it down without being crushed by it. And so they kept carrying it, and they kept demanding that everyone around them carry it too, until a girl who walked with wolves decided that she would not carry it anymore. So I have to ask you, who were the real wolves in this story? Were they the animals in the mountains, the ones who never once harmed a human being, who walked beside a lonely girl and stood between her and the men who wanted to silence her? Or were they the people in the valley, the ones who smiled at church and waved from their porches and locked their doors at night, not against the wilderness outside, but against the truth inside? Think about that, and let me know in the comments what you think, because I have read hundreds of stories like this one, stories about small towns and buried secrets, and the people who eventually dig them up, and I still do not have a clean answer. I do not think there is one. If this story stayed with you, if you felt something, hit that subscribe button and the bell so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Every story on this channel is about the moments that history tried to forget and the people who refused to let it. Like this video if you think Ellie's story deserved to be told. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you thought this was intense, wait until you hear about what happened on a quiet Friday afternoon in Cleveland, Ohio in 1944, when an underground gas storage facility turned an entire neighborhood into a wall of fire that could be seen from 30 miles away. Families were running through the streets. Manholes were exploding, and the company responsible tried to pretend it never happened. That story is coming next. You do not want to miss it.